So hello, this is our week 1 mini lecture. This video will be for Unit 1, Disaster Response by Citizens and Professionals, Week 1, Human Dimensions of Disaster, the Disaster Response Cycle, and Terms and Definitions. So a quick overview for the week. We are going to have 3 readings. The first is uploaded on Blackboard. It is from Khan et al., Disaster Management Cycle, a Theoretical Approach. The second is in your Natural Hazards book, Chapter 1, Introduction to Natural Hazards. And the third is in Maletti, Disasters by Design. It is Chapter 7, Preparedness, Response, and Recovery. We are going to have major assignments are the critical summary essay that is due weekly. There will be an icon where you can upload it in the Blackboard folder. Also a blog post, and again it can be a written blog post or you can post a vlog, a video blog. And then finally there will be a link to the discussion forum for the class activity. I have my previous survey that I used in Hawaii and American Samoa on disaster preparedness and recovery. I put the entire survey up there, including the IRB information and everything, the consent form, just so you can kind of get an idea of what a research survey looks like. But really what I want for this activity is for us to focus on the questions and how we can make it make sense in Maine. What sorts of topics should we be talking about? What sorts of hazards or disasters we should be mentioning? And then what are the interests? What are the needs for the people in Maine? This is going to be the brainstorming phase. There's a link to the discussion forum. I do want you to try to come up with at least 3 additional survey questions that might be useful to Maine citizens. But you can also feel free to adapt or tweak questions that have already been listed by other students or that are already in the survey, but you think rewording them might help. Part of the process of developing a research survey is to consider how survey questions might be read by a lot of different people. So for example, if I have a question, have you ever experienced a disaster? Well, people might be thinking, well, I was in a car accident, that was pretty disastrous. And that's true, that's a way that people use that term, but that's not what I'm trying to get at. So, okay, well, what if we say a natural disaster instead, or something like that? So even small tweaks to words can be very important. Again, we're in the brainstorming phase. Put in everything that you think might possibly be relevant. We won't use all of it, but who knows what we will use. And just throw it out there. We'll keep working on it for the next few weeks. And we want as many options to work from as possible. So the topics that we're discussing this week, first of all, the human dimensions of disaster. These are the ways that humans interact with disaster. So for example, if there is a massive landslide in Bangor and it kills hundreds of people, that's a disaster. Yeah, that has had disastrous effects on the community, and by any definition that we use within these fields, that would be a disaster. If there's a same landslide of the same magnitude and scope, but it's out in the middle of nowhere, nobody's impacted, nobody's affected, nobody even knows that it happened for like a week after it happened, that's not a disaster, even though it's the same event. What makes it a disaster is the way that it affects people. And so that's what we're talking about with the human dimensions, are all the ways in which people are affected by disasters, are impacted by disasters, and prepare for disasters. We'll also be talking about the disaster response cycle. This may also be called the disaster management cycle, different, similar terms like that. But the basic idea behind the disaster response cycle is that disasters are not single events. They happen again and again in society, and societies have to deal with them multiple times over time. The basic structure of the disaster response cycle is we think about preparedness before a disaster. We are getting ready as best we can so that if and when a disaster happens, we're ready for it. It won't affect us as severely as it would if we weren't prepared. Then the disaster strikes. And then we move into the response phase. We have to respond to what is happening. Well, over a period of time, that initial response, just do whatever we can in order to get through, begins to fade into the recovery phase, where we are trying to pick up the pieces, put society back together, put our lives back together, and move on. But part of that recovery phase is going to, again, move back into preparedness for the next time a disaster hits, so that we're not impacted the same way. Depending on what field you are in, depending on how exactly you work with disasters, there may be 6 or 8 different stages within this disaster response cycle. You may just think about these few particular structures. You may, in your job, focus very narrowly on that first day of response after a disaster. And so you can come up with like 8 different stages that even just happen within that immediate response of a disaster. So there's a lot of variation. The stages may overlap. When a disaster, different people may be experiencing different impacts, different things at different stages. Multiple stages can happen at once even. For example, there's a volcano on the big island of Hawaii, Kilauea, that has been erupting for 30 years. And some people lost their homes in the 80s. They've rebuilt, they've moved on with their lives since then, and a few months ago a town was wiped out by the lava flow. So different people are in different stages within this ongoing disaster. The disaster striking has been this stage that has spanned 30 years. It's not always real cut and dry, but the disaster response cycle has been a useful concept for people in different fields to talk about about disaster, and so we will be using it. Now, within the readings themselves, I want you to keep in mind that, first of all, again, don't read these readings like you read a textbook. You are trying to absorb knowledge. You are not trying to learn every single detail of everything that you will be reading. The point of these readings is to start getting an overview of what disasters are in human society. By the time you finish these readings, you'll have heard a lot of the same terms and concepts over and over again, so you'll be learning what they mean and how they're used, and be able to use them yourselves accurately as a disaster professional would. But also in disaster and climate change fields, we necessarily have to work with people who come from other disciplines. And that means understanding how our partners look at the same event, but from a totally different perspective. So like when a disaster manager, a scientist, a politician, an engineer, when they're talking about disaster, they may be talking about the same event, but what exactly do they mean when they're talking about a disaster? What are they talking about? What's important to them? After all these readings, you'll have a good sense of the vocabulary we use, but you'll also have a good introduction to the scope of what we're talking about in this very broad human dimensions of disaster. And you'll be able to talk about it in terms, or you'll be able to understand it in terms that are used by these different fields as well. Now, first we have our Khan et al. That is the one that is uploaded in Blackboard. There are a lot of vocabulary and terms introducing the disaster management cycle, talking about disasters versus hazards, risk, vulnerability, capacities, a lot of these terms that we use so that you can learn how they use them. But this is specifically from the point of view of disaster managers. Disaster managers, their job is to think within this disaster response cycle. They think about disaster from the point of view of society. They think about society from the point of view of disasters. It is always the way that it interacts. And this article is actually, it's brief. It gives you a very good, quick introduction of how the vocabulary is used, and also to the disaster response cycle in general as used by disaster managers. Then we have the Keller and Blodgett. This is the Natural Hazards book. Chapter 1, Introduction to Natural Hazards. It is another introduction to the vocabulary and the concepts of natural disasters, but this time it's talking from a scientific and engineering standpoint. Don't be afraid. It's actually not as scary as it sounds. This is a very readable book. I've quite enjoyed it. But it does go into some of the scientific explanations for the how and the why disasters happen. This is not a science class, remember. We do need to have a baseline understanding of the science of disasters in order to understand this field, in order to work in this field. But when I'm out working, I will always defer to the scientist when we're talking about the science, and they will always defer to me when talking about psychology. We need to understand each other's perspective. We need to have a baseline understanding of each other's knowledge, but keep in mind where our own expertise lies. So this is our baseline introduction to the science and engineering standpoint. And then finally we have Maletti. This is the Disasters by Design, Chapter 7, Preparedness, Response, and Recovery. And again, this is another chapter that discusses an introduction and overview of vocabulary and terms of what disaster means in human society. But specifically, this chapter is looking at the many different aspects of human society that interact with disasters. We're talking about household preparedness. Are there disaster kits in the home? Do kids know what to do if a disaster strikes in most families? We're talking about emergency responders, police and firefighters and rescue workers. We're talking about shelters being open. We're talking about how the media communicates knowledge about what's happening. All of these different things at every stage of the disaster management cycle. So this again gives you a very good introduction and overview to the broad scope of disasters within society. We will be talking next week about vulnerability, risk, and exposure, some of the more individual and societal level, how people are impacted and why they're impacted. And then after that, we'll move into the psychology of disasters. This week is our introduction to disasters in general. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll keep an eye on the forums as well if you want to throw any questions out there or start new forums so that we can discuss various topics within the field. And I look forward to hearing from you.